And now, our final story.
My name is Edward Lewis. I'm a thrift store addict. I found this collage at a thrift store that I really think may be made by the famous musician Frank Zappa. I only paid $5, but I really believe it may be worth a whole lot more. Was this collage really made by Frank Zappa?
In his 3-decade career, Frank Zappa never had a #1 hit and only flirted with the mainstream. Zappa's music was genre-busting, eclectic, and experimental. He was a social critic in his music and his actions, satirizing the counterculture, confronting Congress over music censorship, and championing political and artistic freedoms around the world. But I've never heard that he made visual art.
This is what I was telling you about.
Now, why do you think it's a Frank Zappa piece? There's FZ over here.
It's signed FZ, which I didn't think a whole lot about, but a friend of mine actually called me up and said, you need to look at this website. There's a picture similar to yours, and it's a Frank Zappa collage. And so I went to that website, and there was one very similar, and it was attributed to Frank Zappa.
Well, I'll see. Attributed is the key. That's right. Now, tell me where you found it.
I found it in a thrift store in South Carolina, but the tag on the back shows that it was framed in California.
Let's see. Denny's Paint Shop. And what's the name of this town? Santa Paula, California?
Santa Paula, California.
Now, I would want to take this out of the frame at some point. Is that okay with you? I'll be very careful.
Just don't tear it up.
Well, I'll see what I'm going to find out for you, Edward.
That's why I contacted you.
This says drum shop. An interesting piece of work. Some things are cut, some things are torn. It's ink and watercolor. The symbols are paper, as is this man's jacket. The plaid is painted on. And then up here, we have what looks like it's either a bell for a boxing match or for a fire alarm. There's a real vitality here. It's dense, it's colorful. Zappa certainly was known to have a visual style in his album covers, but I can find almost nothing about him as a painter. Seems he once worked as a greeting card designer, made claymation shorts, and even built a film set. But these references to visual art are fleeting in a career overwhelmingly devoted to music and musical experimentation with his band, the Mothers of Invention, and his later solo projects. Edward mentioned that there's a fan site that has other artwork purportedly by Frank Zappa. Let me see what I can find there. Most of these look nothing like our collage. Here's the piece that Edward thinks resembles his. It clearly has a lot of similarity with our piece. It has the same thick and thin pen and ink lines, but there's no signature, not even FC. And frankly, although some of this looks promising, almost nothing here is verified. Yes, some of the statements about provenance show how unreliable this can be. This artwork was given to a lady I became friends with when I lived in Beverly Hills. She personally knew Frank Zappa. With Edward's piece found in a thrift store, I don't even have that tenuous connection. I need to find a way to link this collage to Frank Zappa. Denny's Paint Shop, that might give us an important clue. I presume that's when this was originally put into a frame. It's a long shot, but maybe they'll have records of who framed this. I can't find the paint store online, but Santa Paula is in Southern California, where Zappa had moved with his family as a teen. My office is seeing if they can get records of when the store closed and run down any of the people on the art website. In the meantime, I'm meeting pop culture historian Michael Walker in the legendary Los Angeles neighborhood of Laurel Canyon, where Frank Zappa lived in the 1960s. I'm trying to find out if this particular pen and ink,
gosh, look at that.
Isn't this fabulous?
Yeah.
If this was done by Frank Zappa. Have you ever heard about his doing any work as a visual artist?
No, I did not know that he did anything like this.
But Michael does tell me that Zappa was a drummer in his high school days, and definitely part of a visual art scene in Laurel Canyon.
Laurel Canyon was just a polyglot with all sorts of artists, real or imagined, right? So But Frank Zappa and Gail Zappa, his wife, and their daughter, Moon Unit, and this entourage that lived at the cabin with them, it was almost like a salon, like in Paris, except that he was running it.
But Michael explains that Zappa stood apart from many of the other musicians and artists surrounding him.
That was when folk rock was just huge. That was the Mamas and the Papas and the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield. He was surrounded, he lived amidst all these people, but he was not doing what they were doing.
Zappa was a fan of radical modern composers, especially Edgar Varese, who experimented with electronic music.
He was doing avant-garde, almost symphonic compositions.
Lyrically, Zappa was also willing to poke fun at the earnest folk scene and the drug use of the day.
He was sort of, doing a reality check for the counterculture. He did not have an abiding love for hippies. He thought perhaps it was sometimes hypocritical. This is a song called Plastic People, and it's a great song because it's a parody both of Frank Zappa's own generation and also sort of the middle-class American generation.
Take a day and walk around. Watch the Nazis run your town. Then go home and check yourself. You think we're singing about someone else, but you're plastic people. Oh, baby, now.
That's basically him busting his own people, which is a brave thing to do at that time. He was more of a commentator and an iconoclast.
Zappa was a political dissident, too. In the mid-1980s, he appeared before Congress to protest music censorship. In all his research into Zappa's artistic experimentation, Michael never came across Frank the collage maker, but he believes that Frank's concept of music was uniquely visual.
Well, he also talked about his music in a three-dimensional way. When he played the guitar, he referred to them as sound sculptures, and so he was making a physical thing in the air, and he loved the idea of moving masses of air around in the big concert halls with the big speakers. Fascinated him.
That's interesting, but I still don't have any proof that this collage was one of his artistic visions. The Santa Paula Library has sent me copies of their business directories. They show Denny's paint store was only open from 1959 to 1963 at the address on our label. If Zappa painted this, he did it before the age of 24. Someone who knew him back then for sure was his younger brother, Bob Zappa. I meet Bob and Calvin Schenkel, the artist who designed many of Zappa's most iconic album covers, at Calvin's studio. Have either one of you seen this?
I've never seen it.
Does it look at all familiar?
Specifically?
No.
No, I never saw it.
But Bob says his brother was making visual art in his teens and early 20s.
He even won a prize for a poster that he did on fire prevention when he was in the 9th grade. And when he was working for a card studio in Claremont, California, he was using silkscreen.
I think he did a TV commercial for Luden's.
Luden's cough drops, yeah.
Frank collaborated with animator Ed Seaman.
I don't remember exactly what it said, but there were no people in it. It was just that visual of the lines and the sound of the record. The visual was dancing to the music.
But very much this notion of sound, and not just here's music and here's a painting, but how do we see these screeching together?
Earlier in LA, he did a lot of ads for the events, the concerts, using collage.
Oh, really?
Well, that's the thing about his music, too. He worked in so many different directions and put it all together in just all kinds of different ways. Classical, jazz, and rock on the same album, and even in the same song.
Calvin says the little art he does have that Frank made reflects this eclecticism.
And I have a copy here of a flyer that he did at the time.
Well, you see the same density and dynamism.
Yeah,
here. There's a lot going on
the
the
cut
page.
of the letters, his style, you can see it in here, the little flourish on the S.
Yes, there are real similarities, but was this done by the same hand? Our researchers at the History Detective's office have been tracking down leads from the website. None have panned out, but there is another lead, the one person who might be able to help settle this. I'm excited. Gail Zappa, Frank's wife, has agreed to meet me. I sent her a scan of the collage. and she asked to meet me at the Professional Drum Shop in Hollywood. Are you Gail?
Hi, Gwen.
So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm very honored. I'm trying to find some material about an early visual piece that I think he might have done. I sent you that scan, but here's the original. Let me show you.
Oh, my goodness. I didn't know I was going to get to see the actual piece.
So here it is. So I'm trying to find out if FC was Frank Zappa.
Okay, that's a big question.
Gail has not seen the collage before, but the art reminds her of how Frank would sometimes draw music before writing or playing it.
This is really similar to a lot of the ways that Frank used to start off a composition. He would make a sketch of it in terms of densities and progression. Because for Frank, music was visual.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's how he saw music. Like mobiles, you know, floating, things crossing each other. And you know what people don't realize is he only ended up in rock and roll because there was no other label that he fit into.
But we also have this pretty conspicuous FC. Did you ever see him use his initials that way?
All the time.
Oh,
And,
tell me.
The first time he went on the road, he had to go to the bank and get traveler's checks because that's just how it happened in those days. Can you imagine? And they rejected them because he could not sign his name the same way twice. And it got to be, starting out, Frank Zappa, and eventually ended up as this sort of FC scribble. And that's consistent. I mean, we see that everywhere.
Gail has another possible clue, and it's much more personal.
I wanted you to see this place because Frank, you know, when we first met, we had very limited budget. And one of the few times that we actually went somewhere was to this place. This is particularly meaningful because of Frank's relationship with the owner, the guy who started this place. Over here we have this fabulous picture. I believe that to be the owner, Bob Yeager. And this is a picture of him in that jacket.
That is very striking. Then Gail points out one more thing that she thinks the owner's stepson can fill us in on.
Well, you know what? Let's get Stan over here and he can tell us.
Now, Frank Zappa was a drummer when he was very young.
Oh, I see.
He was also a visual artist when he was very young. That's something very few people know.
See, I didn't know that.
I tell Edward that much of what I had heard was circumstantial, until Gail Zappa brought me to the Professional Drum Shop in Hollywood, where they'd had something in storage for half a century.
In the mid-'60s or so, we had a huge rental situation, and this was one of our rental things that we had. And it's a bell, which is not working too well now. But that's the first thing I noticed was that up in there.
It certainly is the same kind of thing. The loving recreation of the Professional Drum Shop leaves Gail with no doubt.
This is absolutely Frank Zappa.
That is amazing. That is amazing. Good $5 investment, I hope.
I asked my colleague Elise LeRae how much she'd appraise this for. She said, oh, probably $25,000.
$25,000. I made a good investment then.
What I find even more exciting is the way that this opens up dimensions about Frank Zappa. You can hear this piece of art.
I always liked it. I appreciated it then. I really appreciate it now. I think I won't let it out of my sight.